first thing that I just wanted to begin the session with is the idea of reading aloud. Now, I'll start anecdotally, actually. Last week, when it was World Book Day, we had a Dear Day afternoon planned, and I'll come to what a Dear Day afternoon is later, and it probably has happened and something you're familiar with. But essentially, the students were encouraged to drop everything and read. And traditionally, what we do with our Dear Day afternoons is that students bring in something that they want to read, and they sit and they read it silently, be it a comic book, be it a biography, autobiography, fiction book, whatever they fancy reading. Now, last week with Dear Day, we tried something a little bit new, and we actually introduced class readers to our classes. So all of Year 8 were reading The Colour of the Sun by David Armand in whatever room they were in. All of Year 9 were reading Noughts and Crosses, again, in whichever room, whichever subject, they dropped everything and read. And all of Year 7 were reading The Boy at the Back of the Class. Now, as the person who organised this initiative, I had this absolute methodical map of where all the books needed to be delivered to and who was reading what in each classroom. And would you believe I didn't count myself out any books? So there I was, period 5, all the students ready to start reading The Colour of the Sun by David Armand. And I realised that mine was the only room where I hadn't delivered any books to. So I found myself in a little bit of a flap and thought, here you are organising World Book Day, and your initiative is not going to take off. So I said to the students, right, what you need to do, can you just read silently? I'll try and track these books down, and you read silently. And they proved my point, because a few of the key players in that class said, oh, miss, I find silent reading so difficult. Can you not read to us? And I said, well, that was the plan. We were all going to read together, but I don't have a copy of the book. Anyway, long story short, I called on dear old Roald Dahl again, and actually dug out some of his short stories. And I sat there and I read aloud to the students, which again, they're in Year 8. Some of them are a little bit too cool for it. But by the end of about 3-4 pages in, every one of those students had stopped reading their own books, they'd stopped whatever they were doing, and they were captivated. And I do think a lot is said for reading aloud. And even if you're not an English specialist in whichever subject you are, don't ever underestimate the power that comes from reading aloud to students. I think it really does sort of bring a sense of nostalgia, and it makes them feel comfortable, and it really unlocks the text. So part of a passage that I read last week in an assembly for World Book Day was the infamous passage that described Miss Trunchbull. So I'm going to read it now, just to humour myself on this Monday afternoon. And we'll just talk about why reading aloud can be such an interesting tool to promote reading for pleasure in school. So Miss Trunchbull, the headmistress, was something else altogether. She was a gigantic holy terror, a fierce tyrannical monster who frightened the life out of pupils and teachers alike. There was an aura of menace about her, even at a distance, and when she came up close, you could almost feel the dangerous heat radiating from her, as if from a red-hot rod of metal. When she marched, Miss Trunchbull never walked, she always marched like a stormtrooper, with long strides and arms a-swinging. When she marched along a corridor, you could actually hear her snorting as she went. And if a group of children happened to be in her path, she ploughed right on through them like a tank, with small people bouncing off her to left and right. Now, just by reading that passage aloud to our students, we have helped some of our more vulnerable, less fluent readers decode the meaning, because essentially half the battle is when you put a piece of text in front of a student is them understanding the meaning. So just from that passage alone, if I am a student with particularly weak literacy, I'm going to see that page in front of me, and all that's going to happen if I'm reading it aloud or reading it in my head is I'm going to fixate on the fact that I don't know what tyrannical means. I don't even know how to say tyrannical. And you might have been there yourselves in school yourselves when your teacher would say, well, you're reading the next line, or you're reading page 18. And all you do then is you flick forward to page 18 and you panic and you look at the words that are going to come up that you don't quite know how to pronounce. And you don't listen to pages 15 or 16 or even page 19 because you're just so relieved that your page is done. And therefore it really really hinders your understanding and your pleasure. Lots of people, when I've sort of done this session before, lots of people were saying that some of their school memories were exactly that, being told you're going to read that paragraph and not being able to understand it or look at keywords and really struggle with it. So I do think never underestimate the power of reading aloud to your students, because what it does is, as I've said there, it decodes as you go, just by the tonal inflections of your voice, just by where you pause, just by the words you put emphasis on, you're helping them understand. And essentially those things that I've just covered. So the students who have to struggle to translate almost and decode a piece of text when it's in front of them will not enjoy it. Essentially, it's no surprise that students who read more and have access to better vocabulary enjoy reading more. If it's a laborious task for them because they can't decode it, then they will struggle, and they will be the students that say, I don't like reading. But what they don't realise is they're being tricked into reading by you reading to them and them following along. And that's why it's so important, as I've said, your intonation, your emphasis helps them decode and helps them make sense of what they are reading. By reading aloud to an entire class, it avoids that panic of being picked or being singled out, although we will come back to that in a second. And it automatically encourages active reading. As I'm reading, I'm taking the pressure off them. So if I tell them before I read that passage of Miss Trunchbull, and I say, right, I'm going to read a passage to you in a second, and when I'm done, I want you to have identified 3 different ways that Miss Trunchbull has been described, or 2 different ways she moves, then the students are able to decode that. If they're having to read from their copy, think that they're going to get picked on and answer the questions, it makes it more tricky for them. You might tell them to make certain notes, make Cornell notes, make mind maps. You might give them a picture of Miss Trunchbull, and as they're listening to you read, they're mind mapping words around her. It makes reading far more of an active activity rather than passive. And again, that's something we'll move to talk about. And modelling reading is sometimes all it takes to enthuse those reluctant readers. So you reading, you pausing, you maybe stumbling over your words, getting things wrong, those honest mistakes or those getting things wrong is sometimes what enthuses students, because they realise that you make mistakes too and they're not afraid, and it makes that classroom a much safer environment. There's an incredible TED talk which I've linked at the very end of this presentation by Rebecca Bellingham, and it's entitled Why We Should All Be Reading Aloud to Children. And this is one of my favourite quotations from it, and this sense that reading for many students feels like a locked building that they can't get into. And so they say, well, I don't read for fun. Why would I read for fun? Because it's not fun, because I'm constantly trying to decode and I'm constantly trying to work out what these different words mean. But when teachers or parents read aloud to them, they give them the key. They unlock the book for them. And that really helps them to think, to enjoy, and to read for pleasure, hopefully. One way that also, and this was originally in my PowerPoint, but I've cut it a little bit short, something that you might want to consider is audiobooks, and using audiobooks and using sort of having students listen to being read aloud to, and how that might unlock doors for them. That's some research that goes with it. I know, obviously, that when you're reading aloud to students, there's a few things that you need to make sure you've prepped in advance, not teaching you to suck eggs here, but make sure that you've read the material beforehand and that you are anticipating any questions about tricky vocabulary. And it might be, again, that you start the lesson with a bit of a glossary before you unpick that. Highlight the passages in books, in textbooks, that naturally lend themselves to be read aloud. Too often I've gone, oh, well, we'll read all of this. And then I've realised it's really quite dense and dull in the middle. And I think actually we could have summarised these key paragraphs and we could have focused more on certain parts of it. Pop in some post-it notes into your own notes to look at where you might pause for questions. And something that I think we all get out of the habit of too quickly, I know I certainly have, is planning questioning in our lessons. And questioning just happens naturally. And then you find that you are bouncing a lot of what and a lot of simple questions into your lessons. Actually pre-planning your questions with the passages that you know that you are going to unpick is a really, really good habit to get into. And again, one that I don't do enough. As I've said, don't be afraid to be silly with it, to read aloud with enthusiasm, intonation, intonation and the occasional accent if you're that way inclined, because don't be surprised how quickly even the coolest of students can lose themselves in being read to, regardless of their age. I've yet to find a student that doesn't enjoy being read to, even if they pretend that they don't. I'm thinking about, again, depending on what your subject is, Chris, I don't know what your subject specialism is. It might even be English, in which case I'm completely preaching to the converted here. But just thinking about what else can you read that the students might want to connect to. So is it that there's a newspaper article that links to this topic, a journal article, a first-hand account that could really broaden their horizons? And what do you want students to do when reading is happening in your classroom? Are you just expecting them to listen? Do you want them to jot down their own questions? As I said, are they, if I'm describing Miss Trunchbull, are they drawing Miss Trunchbull as I'm describing her? What is it that they're doing whilst you are reading aloud? Or another classmate's reading aloud, because it doesn't have to always be us. So supporting your students to read aloud is exactly, almost like I planned it, where we're going to talk about next. So it doesn't always have to be you reading in the classroom. Obviously, we want to make reading a collaborative activity in order for students to really enjoy it. So as I've said, make it fun, splitting up parts of the text. If it is a fiction text, allowing them to sort of put on silly voices if that's the thing that they really want to do. Something that I do is, if I've got a group of students that are happy to read, whether this is fiction, non-fiction, whatever it is we're reading, I use one of the random classroom name generators so that they don't feel like that it's the same people always getting picked or the same people not getting picked. So it's very, very quick. Classroom name generator, right, put your hand up if you don't mind reading a part or you don't mind reading a stanza, and then it gives that fun element to it. I sometimes have students who say, oh miss, can I just read the stage directions? I just want my name to be in the random name generator. But at least that's better than, you know, reading nothing at all. So popping that on the screen and, you know, getting the Wheel of Fortune style, and then what they've accidentally been tricked into reading because it feels like a bit of a gamble, it feels like something fun. Again, you're probably familiar with this one. If you are going to nominate students to read and randomise that, and it might be students who haven't volunteered, do you give them the option of how much they read? So the old sentence, paragraph, page. A student might only feel comfortable reading a sentence. They might want to take a whole page, but you give them that sort of autonomy, and that's agreed at the start of the lesson. So I think that certainly takes the pressure off. Another really random thing that works, students with lucky numbers. So often if I'm reading sort of a whole chapter or a few key pages, I'll write on the board all of the page numbers that I'm going to read, and then they all want to pick their number. Oh miss, can I read page 11? Oh, I really want to read page 18. And again, because it feels competitive, oh well, I wanted page 11, he's got page 11 now. They're tricked into reading because there's that competitive element of it. And again, explaining small and big parts in advance. You might have a student who says, oh well, I'm happy to read a short paragraph, but I don't want to read a whole page, and just letting them know which ones are going to be more accessible for them. Also pretending I really want to read. Oh, but I'll read this. And then a student always asks if they can. And ultimately, the same as everything, praise and rewards are really good ways to really encourage students. So I don't know what each school system has. We have something called red stamps. So at the end of every lesson, our students have to get a normal stamp in their planner, their homework diary. But if they have gone over and above, we reward them with a red stamp. And quite often, if a student reads aloud or reads significantly, not just, you know, reads a couple of paragraphs or reads one paragraph, if they read significantly in class, then they will be rewarded with a red stamp, an over and above stamp. So just as like anything, rewards and praise are a great way to go. Bringing competition into the classroom. You know, have you got, if you're going to, at the moment I'm reading Romeo and Juliet with year 8, do I sit all my Capulets together, I sit all my Montagues together, and then they read their parts, and it's nice to be read to. Other things you might do, and this links to something called reciprocal reading that I'm going to talk to you about shortly, is small group reading. If you know that you've got a newspaper article, a passage, a page of a textbook that you want the students to all have read by the end of the lesson, that doesn't mean you have to read it collaboratively. It's a really good oracy and reading comprehension activity to break them off into small groups and get them to read it together. And you'll find that that breaks down a lot of the barriers for students. This is the active and passive reading part that I was alluding to at the very beginning. So silent reading. Now, I'm not going to lie, where we are currently at Hazeley, we do silent reading at the start of our English lessons. Our year 7s, 8s and 9s silent read for 10 minutes at the start of their English lesson, every lesson, and they were silent reading in form time, one form time a week. Now, the benefits of silent reading are here. Routines are great. They know as soon as they walk into the classroom, they're getting their reading book out. It calms everyone at the start of the lesson. In terms of a behaviour and climate technique, it's brilliant. It's great. It gets them right into a routine. It models good reading, and you know that students read every day. Now, I've put that on that there to be deliberately controversial. You might not know that students read every day. You know that students, at least for 10 minutes a day, mime reading in their English lesson and have a book in front of them. It may well be the same book that they've been reading since last March. It may be a book that's upside down. It may be a book that they have never actually read, or they've read 1,700 times. So whilst silent reading is great, and obviously it promotes the visual of reading, something that we are moving more and more towards is this active reading. So as I've said there, do we really love silent reading? How long has that book been lurking at the bottom of their bag? And just because they're calm and compliant doesn't mean that they're engaged and learning. Who is reading with them? And that's something to think about. Something that we have changed up a little bit of late is encouraging teachers to read collaboratively with those books that I mentioned at the beginning. You know that students sit in silence with a book every day, but what they do at primary school more is the sense of book talk. And as they're reading, they're being asked questions. Or it might be that if they're reading their own books, when you answer the register, you need them to answer the register with a new word that they've just discovered in their book, or answer the register with a short description of a character that is in the book that they're currently reading, just so you know that they are actually reading something and engaging with it. Now, thinking about what good readers do, and again, this sort of blurred line between a session that was essentially about reading for pleasure, well, what we're coming to the conclusion is students won't read for pleasure unless they feel like they're good at reading. And if they feel like they're good at reading, and then they can access their things, and it's using that metaphor that we had before about unlocking reading for them. So what good readers do naturally is they ask questions as they read, whether they know that they're asking questions or not. They're decoding it. What's going to happen next? Where have I seen a character like this before? Or are they going to reintroduce a character from a previous chapter? They make predictions as they go along about what comes next. We say never to judge a book by its cover, but good readers do. They acknowledge that the book that they've just picked up looks like it's a similar genre to something that they've read before. Or again, if we're not talking about fiction, we're not talking about English lessons, even if they are coming across a new topic in history, geography, philosophy, good readers decode as they go. They don't even know that they're doing it. They're asking questions about what might come next. They're making predictions. They're using, if they've got a page of a textbook in front of them, titles and subtitles to make connections metacognitively and work through together. But as I've said, I don't know if we all are secondary school teachers, but as secondary school teachers, we aren't here to do phonics. We aren't here to teach students to read, but we are here to make them better readers and therefore enjoy reading more, because no one tends to enjoy something that they don't feel that they're good at. So as I've alluded to, what makes reading for pleasure is when students feel that they're getting something successful out of it and they're getting rewarded for reading. And with English, we quite often have that idea that with maths or science, there's immediate gratification, there's immediate success. I didn't know how to do this equation, and by the end of the lesson, I did know how to do this equation. So sometimes with English, it doesn't feel as achievable as that. But something that you can do to essentially improve that sense of success and fulfillment is treat reading a little bit like an analytical, mysterious process. And something that you may or may not be familiar with is this idea of reciprocal reading and using oracy approaches. So whilst I'm head of English, I also run Oracy Whole School, and something that we promoted and that we've got in our planners is these Oracy group roles. So no matter what subject students are in, whether they're in drama, whether they're in philosophy, whether they're in maths, what their teachers can do is break them off into groups of 6 and give them each a role for whatever topic that they are discussing. And our students are becoming more and more familiar with this now, because they know, that thing in the front of my planner, okay, last time I was the challenger, so that meant I had to keep asking loads of questions, but this time I'm the builder, so actually rather than challenging everyone, I need to say that was a great answer, let me add to this point. So that's something that students are familiar with from an oracy perspective. And Voice 21 do some incredible stuff with oracy and promoting oracy in schools. Now, what goes hand in hand with that, and it's a very, very similar premise, is this idea of reciprocal reading, which you may or may not have heard of. And it's a similar idea, having different roles. So if I'm setting my students off in groups, and I'm giving them, as I've said, is it a passage of a text? Is it a newspaper article? Is it a load of sort of detailed scientific facts and I need them to decode it? But whatever it is I've given them, giving them a role and a responsibility can really improve the quality of their reading and the quality of their understanding, but also this sense of success. So reciprocal reading does exactly what I've just shown on the previous slide with those oracy roles. It gives them a job. So they break off into groups to read a passage, and as I've said, it can be a passage from a textbook, it doesn't have to be fiction, and each one of them has a role. So the leader, the person who sets everything off, who keeps everything going, the predictor. So it might be that when they've read a particular page, the predictor stops everyone and asks, well, what do we think is going to happen? Or what's similar? What might be the consequence of this? The clarifier asks lots of questions. The summarizer tends to feed back at the end. And the questioner almost deliberately tries to ask the out-of-the-box questions. Now, if you can, and I hate to use the word train, but I do mean the word train, if you can familiarise students with these sort of approaches to reading, you will find that their reading improves no end, because they aren't trying to do all of these things at once. They're not trying to decode it and make predictions, and they start to realise what makes good reading. And what makes good reading is all of these things, teaching themselves to ask questions as they go, to make predictions as they go, to summarise in their heads after they've read a passage. And again, going back to metacognition, those metacognitive practices as they go along. So the leader takes charge, begins to read aloud. The questioner asks key questions. Why did that happen? Do we think it's positive or negative? How has it been shown? And you can give them question stems. Like I said, ours are in our school planners, so they've always got access to these, and they don't feel like they've been sort of abandoned to have this role. They've got quite a structured role. The predictor does work better for fiction texts. So it can be things, everything like, what do we predict from the headline? What do we predict from the title? How is this similar to what we've read before? The clarifier is for a more able, and again, these naturally lend themselves to ability groupings. And then the summarizer tends to be the confident students who are happy to verbally feedback, but might struggle with reading on their own. So that's usually the person who feeds back. So that's reciprocal reading, and there's loads of stuff about reciprocal reading online. If you've ever come across a fellow called Alex Quigley, he's an absolute dreamboat as far as literacy and reading is concerned. He has written books about the vocabulary gap, and Hazeley, we're a Pixel school, so he's done an awful lot of work with sort of Pixel, which we've worked with. But he really promotes this reciprocal reading because it makes students realize how to access reading, how to approach a text. And the more times they do this in class, the more naturally this will come to them when they're in an exam scenario. And we are finding as well sort of links between their ability to read and other subjects. So I share my office with the head of science and the head of maths, and all too often now we're noticing that the wordier problem questions in science and maths are being struggled with by the same students who are struggling in English. So one example was that in English, they are asked to compare and contrast poems when they have to have two poems side by side and they write to compare and contrast them. In science, they got given a compare and contrast question. And one of the students wrote, "I'm sorry, miss, I don't know what contrast means." So it's, again, looking at how they have been taught to read in English and realizing that it's the same approach that they take in other subjects. So I'm going to skip that one for now. So just going back to this idea then about reading for pleasure, and all I've sort of done is gone about methodical approaches to reading and lots of different approaches to reading. But actually, as I keep sort of hammering home, students won't read for pleasure unless they feel like they're good at it. And until they feel like they are good at reading and that they can access reading and that they enjoy reading, then they aren't going to be picking up a book in their spare time or whatever it is they choose to pick up. So going back to reciprocal reading, why it can promote reading for pleasure, it narrows down, as I've said, all those things that they need to do. Giving students a responsibility can improve more enjoyable and less daunting. Taking reading from inside your head to a group discussion. If you said to students, oh, would you prefer to do this alone or would you prefer to do this in a group? You'd often find that students would rather talk about things than write things down, particularly if they're the students who are more reluctant where it comes to literacy. Grouping them off to do this reciprocal reading and to read in small groups is a really, really useful tool and becomes much more enjoyable. By giving them this toolkit, they can then go away and think about those skills. So we've got our reciprocal reading question stems on bookmarks as well. So when they're in the library and they are sort of reading independently, they are decoding because they're reading the key questions from the reciprocal reading in groups. And as I've said that, it doesn't always have to be this laborious task of, right, let's get them into groups and you six go over there and you six go over there. If they become really, really familiar with the roles, when you are reading a passage to them, you can say, right, well, I'm going to read this passage to you now. And when I'm finished, Molly, you're going to be the summarizer. So you're going to summarize everything that I've just said. Adam, you're going to be the questioner. So as I'm reading to you, jot down a couple of questions that you've got about this text. And Zach, you're going to deliberately, and we've all got a Zach in our classrooms who likes to just be there, what about this, miss? But how about that, miss? And you tell Zach that when you finish the passage, he's going to deliberately tell me a couple of things that he disagrees with. So those group roles and those approaches to reading doesn't have to be massively laborious. And like I said, group work on a Friday afternoon, but it's just they become really familiar with, well, what makes a good reader? What makes a good reader is someone who can ask questions, who can agree and disagree, who can summarize, and bringing them those roles means that they feel like they are good at reading. Another thing essentially is reading role models. So us as teachers and as teachers from all subjects, and not just teachers. Something that I was really, really pleased about last week, as I've alluded to, we had World Book Day. And on World Book Day, the teaching staff and support staff are encouraged to dress up. And the students don't in secondary, but we will get our teachers and our support staff to dress up. Now, usually the only members of support staff that will dress up are the library team and occasionally a couple of teaching assistants. But this year it was incredible to see that all of our office team dressed as Dalmatians. Our receptionist was a Dalmatian, our PA to the principal, they were all Dalmatians, and then the head of our office team was Cruella de Vil. And it was just great to see that reading was becoming, books and promoting this was becoming a way more sort of whole school effort, because what we also did as part of our Dear Day period 5 was that those students who didn't want to read aloud and didn't want to read in class actually read one-to-one with a member of staff. But that wasn't just a member of teaching staff. So we had all these lovely Dalmatians out there reading with some of our most vulnerable students one-to-one. And that idea that reading doesn't have to be just an English teacher's job. It can be any teacher, any teaching assistant, and even the lady in the office who's dressed like Cruella de Vil. So reading role modelling is really important there. So if you are still promoting silent reading, read when they read. And then when you finished your 5-10 minutes silent reading, you tell them, oh, I just got to this really good bit in my book and this is what happened. Has anyone read this? Has anyone read this by another author? What do you think? This is what's happened. What do you think might happen next? And then next time you get to tell them whether it's happened or not. So involve them in what it is you're reading. Talk about books. Don't be afraid to derail your lesson to talk about books. Or, you know, if someone mentions a film, lots of books books are being turned into Netflix series, lots of books are being turned into films, and please remind them that sometimes these series were books first, and just have that conversation. Have books on display. I often, again, I know it's an English classroom, but across the building we have books on our windowsills. If students want to borrow them, they can. Make recommendations and promote wider reading, and as I said, don't be afraid to derail your lesson to talk about books and things that you like to read. Another thing is homework. Now, I'm excited, and I don't know a great deal about this yet, but I've been told that Microsoft Teams are building in a function onto class Teams where they can record students reading aloud, and where you can set assignments that are based on students reading. So it may well be that we move to a place where, almost like recording a mini podcast, students are reading to the computer for homework, and they're recording snippets, and they are looking at reading fluency as well, from what I understand. So thinking about how often do you set a reading homework, and how can you know if the reading has actually been done? Is it that, again, you use those reciprocal reading roles, that you, okay, so you're going to go home and you're going to read this, and this half of the class, you're going to come back with your questions. The other half of the class, you're going to come back with your summaries, or break them into, you know, smaller groups. This is the bit that you're going to read, and then you're going to bring it back. That flipped learning model can really lend itself to reading. Now, do you think you can name any of the most popular authors on the What Kids Are Reading list from last year? David Walliams, absolutely. Yeah, he's right up there, isn't he? Okay, so let me just show you some of the most popular authors from last year. So we've got Jeff Kinney from Diary of a Wimpy Kid. We've got David Walliams, correctly named. We've still got Harry Potter up there, and we've still got Roald Dahl up there as well. Wonder by R.J. Palacio is up there as one of the most read books. Now, this is, I have to just give a disclaimer for this. This data actually comes from, we run Accelerated Reader, and I know a lot of the schools run Accelerated Reader. So these are the top quizzed on authors from last year. So that's why you might notice something like Of Mice and Men is obviously a curriculum text. So whilst students are reading it, it tends to be more that they're reading it in their English lessons rather than reading it for pleasure. So these are our sort of key authors that students are still reading. It's good to see, you know, Alex Rider's Stormbreaker, that's been knocking around for a while now. First Harry Potter book came out 25 years ago this year, which is terrifying. But Jeff Kinney and David Walliams are still just absolutely running away with it. And I just wanted us to think about why that might be. So here's some lists. So last year, in the age group, I think this one is year 7. Let me just move that down. Yeah. In year 7 last year, the most popular book was for everyone, Gangster Granny by David Walliams, Diary of a Wimpy Kid for boys. If you just look at that list there, there's just no one else really featuring. It's all Jeff Kinney and it's all David Walliams. They're just completely stealing the show. Year 8, again, absolutely the same. We've got a couple of core curriculum texts sneaking in there. So for instance, The Hunger Games is something that I know quite a lot of secondary schools do. Of Mice and Men, again, and The Boy in the Striped Pajamas tend to be on the curriculum. And then year 9 to year 11, the most read book or the most quizzed on book is Of Mice and Men, which, as I've said, is no coincidence, because it's probably because they're all doing it in their English lessons, and then their English teachers are sending them into the library to do a quiz on it. The same with Inspector Calls and Animal Farm. But you're still seeing, even in year 9, you've still got Diary of a Wimpy Kid there. And then you have got Roald Dahl sneaking in there as well. So what this tells us, is that our students have an awful lot in common with what they are reading. It tells us that they are deeply, deeply influenced by their friends. So if they see their friends reading Diary of a Wimpy Kid, they're often likely to pick it up. It does show us the level of challenge in the texts that they read are low. They choose easy books to read. And that's something, again, maybe about that fear of failure. But our higher ability students are still reading Harry Potter. So if you read Harry Potter back in the day, back 25 years ago or such, then you've still got some common ground with them. It also tells us that David Walliams and Jeff Kinney must have very nice holiday homes, because they're absolutely. But something that's quite interesting, I think, is it's indicative of the sort of the dying out of bookshops. Now, yes, David Walliams and Jeff Kinney will go through sort of what their main themes and ideas are soon, but what you will also notice that these are books that are readily available in Sainsbury's and Tesco's, other supermarkets are available. So if parents are wanting to promote reading at home and don't really know what to pick, it does tend to be that when they're going around the supermarket, they'll grab the David Walliams books because they are so advertised there. And rather than, you know, going into a bookshop, they'll just grab whatever is there. So I do think that's something else that's linking to it. So something that we notice about David Walliams books then are easily recognisable and easily accessible, as I've just alluded to. There's lots of humour. There's lots of neologisms, one of my favourite words. A neologism is when you make up your own word. David Walliams does it all the time. Roald Dahl used to do it all the time as well. So sort of eliding words together. The books are emotive, but always under the guise of humour. And also something that I think is a little bit of a selling point with these is David Walliams records all the audiobooks. So again, if we're going back to this idea about students liking to be read aloud to, then he's not afraid of a silly voice. And so I think that's part of the reason they are quite so popular. Obviously, you might be aware of there are some sort of controversial, or there's been a little bit of controversy around David Walliams because his characters do tend to be quite two-dimensional, stereotypical, and some of the humour is a little bit close to the mark. So do be careful. Don't just necessarily go out there and start recommending and shouting from the rooftops that David Walliams is the best author ever, because there is some controversy there. But Jeff Kinney as well, all of these Diary of a Wimpy Kid books, I don't understand what the attraction is. So I had to sit down and try and find out why every student in my year 7 and 8 classes constantly reading Diary of a Wimpy Kid books. The conclusions I've come to is, again, there's elements of humour. They're easily accessible, they're written from a first-person narrative, and they're written with lots of pictures and as a diary entry. So journal. It's a journal, it's not a diary, as I was corrected. They're even cooler than a diary, they're journals. So students have got this idea that they are wanting to read things that look fun still, even when they're in year 7 and 8, and have got that element of humour that ties those books together. The one thing that we can sort of take reassurance from, though, is that they are still trying to include some of the key themes that our students can identify with. But that wasn't so much about you running out and getting a copy of The World's Worst Teachers, but it was just even engaging with conversations with our students. Something that we've recently printed as a result of Year 8 Parents' Evening is a load of posters that essentially say, if you like David Walliams, this is your next step. Because that's quite often what parents say, that, well, my son or daughter has read all of the David Walliams, or they've read all of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and I can't get them out of it. What next? So even if you just type in, I think the website was called Book Matchmakers, and just something like that, just so you know what the next level is, what the next recommendation is, so that they're not still reading Diary of a Wimpy Kid when they're in the old people's home. So just the last thing that I wanted to talk about was anything that we might see around schools. So Chris, I'm going to come back to you again. Is there anything that your school has done or that you've come across that promotes reading? I know I've already mentioned Dear Day, I've already mentioned Accelerated Reader. It might be that your school or schools follow the same sort of tact. Anything that you have come across that promotes reading? Ooh. Oh, the whole school reads the same book. Wow, okay, so we've gone year groups, but the whole school. Wow, fabulous. That's great. So using sort of the reading roles and sort of the group discussion roles. Oh, including all the adults. That's like the most amazing book group ever. It's like a book club. Ah, incredible. We do have something along those lines, but again, it's not the whole school. So what we started a few years ago now, gosh. Oh, okay, fab. Yeah, reciprocal. And again, if you've already got the Oracy foundations there, you'll find that the reciprocal reading comes really easily to them, because a lot of the roles are very, very similar. And there's loads out there. Don't reinvent the wheel, steal it all. And like I said, one little click on Alex Quigley's website, and you'll find that he's got loads of stuff there about reciprocal reading. And that screenshot with the detective guy, I think that was just a TES resource. So there's absolutely loads out of there for reciprocal reading. Let me just whiz through some of the things then. but it sounds like you've got it covered. So literacy and reading day in tutor time. You've probably seen these dotted around schools on your classroom doors. Miss Stapleton's favourite book is, or Miss Stapleton is currently reading, which is great. We had for World Book Day, teachers just record a very quick sort of vox pop, a very quick video that went onto Teams about what their favourite book of all time is or what they're reading at the moment. Dear Day and Hour, so drop everything and read. And like I said, that's currently constantly evolving at the moment, because it used to be, as I said, bring a book in and read it in silence. And we found that one size doesn't fit all approach, because some students just are automatically switched off by that. They really struggle. So we are looking at, as we've alluded to, whole school or whole year group readers. Book talk and reading mentors. This is something I really want to get off the ground post-COVID. We were a bit sort of, as you know, everyone has been inhibited by the fact that we used to have our sixth formers reading with our younger years, but once the bubbles happened because of COVID, we've not been able to have anything like that. So that's something that we're looking to bring back in secondary, certainly. And we used to have a dog come in as well. So I'm going to see if I can get that back on the cards. So we'd have a dog come in on a Wednesday afternoon, and the students would sit and read to the dog, because dogs don't judge you on how fast you read, and they don't judge you if you pronounce the words wrong. And some of our really vulnerable learners found it really, really calming. And there's loads of charities and agencies that will do that, that will bring in a dog, a little bit like a therapy dog, who so goes into hospices and hospitals. And the students absolutely loved it. The waiting list for that was unbelievable. And one day, my utopian dream is that loads of homeless dogs will come in and will read with the students, and then the parents will adopt them. I think that's just me getting a bit carried away with this utopian dream there. And World Book Day activities, which I've got here. So our staff in costume, you can see a gangster granny, you can see who else have I got there, Daisy and Gatsby. I've got, we had George, Lenny and Curly's wife that year. That was fun. There we go, there's George and Lenny and Curly's wife. And just getting the students to see us all in fancy dress. The students didn't dress up, but they saw us all dressed up, and it starts the conversation all day. They had to tick off on a card who they've seen, and sort of that idea of who they were looking out for. Our drop everything and read, we took virtual as well. So when we had our Dear Days during lockdown, the teachers actually recorded little audiobook sound bites, and the students could go in and choose which teacher they listened to reading to them. And something else we did is we hid secret words and secret challenges within our passage reading, and the students would have to email us if they found or heard your secret word, or they'd answered your secret question, so you knew that they had actually listened to it. So we kept those hiding in there. Now this initiative, this is something called Hazeley Fest, and that's actually our new year sixes before they come up to us in year 7. So what we do is we read Wonder, which I think a lot of the primary schools are reading, but our feeder schools don't read it as a set text, so I think we've got at least one more year of it. So what we do is we gift them all a copy of Wonder. They take it, it's theirs. We come into their primary schools with Harvey the Husky, our school mascot. We give out copies of Wonder, and we say, this is your book to keep. The only thing we ask of them is that they read it over the summer. And again, we give them a link to the audiobook if they struggle a little bit with their literacy. We think Wonder is a great core text for transition because of its key messages, and this idea about sort of all having the same values and why blend in when you were born to stand out. So they get gifted a copy. Now, Hazeley Fest is a transition event which we haven't been able to run because of COVID, but we're going to run again this year, where the students sleep over at the school before they've even started at the school. So they come to meet all their different primary schools, and they come and they do a little bit of Duke of Edinburgh stuff, and they go out and try and build tents and roast marshmallows and stargaze. But one of the most lovely things that we do when they all come to Hazeley Fest, I think there was about 160 of them that came and stayed the night, is we all read Wonder before bedtime, and they had hot chocolate and marshmallows, and we read to them and we read with them, and the students still remember it now. These guys are in year 10 now, and they remember that, about how they all got this copy of Wonder, and then they passed it on, and they sort of, some of them gave it back, some of them went back to the library, but they passed it on. So just really sort of promoting reading from the minute that they get into school, and all reading the same transition text. Now, this is something that, again, you might have heard mentioned, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this afternoon because it's, again, not reading for pleasure, but it's certainly the way things are going. So there's obviously this document, Chris, you've just mentioned year 4, so I'm going to guess that you're probably primary rather than secondary. There is obviously lots of these EEF documents out there, improving literacy in Key Stage 1, improving literacy in Key Stage 2, all the way up to improving literacy in secondary schools. And something that I feel like we're going to move more towards than ever now is this idea of thinking about how you read in different subjects. So, for instance, reading in mathematics, and how is the reading that's happening in maths different but also similar to the reading that they're going to do in English. So if you see at the top here, this is just a resource that's been created by another sort of online platform, but looking at all the different types of reading. Am I skimming? Am I scanning? Am I close reading? Am I questioning? And that links nicely to that reciprocal reading stuff. So there's, again, loads of key resources out there. I'm not going to go into disciplinary literacy this afternoon because I could do another whole hour on it, but it's just a bit of a buzzword that I think we're going to be looking out for over the next 12 to 18 months in education, to recognise that students are reading in many different ways, and even if they don't realise it, they're using the same metacognitive processes. So any questions? I don't know, I've talked at you for 55 minutes, I'm so sorry. But if you have got any questions, do obviously let me know, and I'll send this PowerPoint to you if you need it, because it's got lots of links there that include everything from the TED Talk that I referenced to the What Kids Are Reading reports. Again, if your school does accelerated reader, you'll have access to that anyway. Or if you didn't know it existed, go to your librarian and ask, is there a primary version? What have we got? What are kids reading, and what could be the next steps? Again, I'm pretty sure that it was called the Book Matchmakers website, which was the one that recommended other books they might enjoy. And I've linked the Key Stage 3 and 4 literacy EEF document at the bottom there. But those are available for every key stage. Oh, yes, Alex Quigley, that is exactly who you need to check out. And he has, there's loads of short videos there that he does. And again, I don't know if you are a Pixel school, or you might have a Pixel school in your trust or around, but part of the Pixel reading, Alex Quigley's made some more videos for that. So if you do know of anyone that's got access to Pixel, then he's done some more reciprocal reading and CPD videos for that. But Alex Quigley is your guy. He's the guru of reading. So that's me done with 5 minutes to spare.
No, thank you, Georgina. Thank you for keeping the time. That was absolutely brilliant. We really appreciate it.